Thanks, Karen. All right, so welcome everyone to our third roundtable, which is all about cultural responsiveness, and it's going to be a facilitated discussion, which is a little bit different to the way we have been running these, but I'm hoping that you will find it helpful. So before we go any further, and I'm sorry I don't really have much voice, I'd just like to acknowledge that the community of psychology educators in Australia recognises the traditional custodians of the lands and waterways where our homes and workplaces are located. And further, we acknowledge the cultural diversity of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples and pay respect to elders past, present and future. Sorry, I'm just really struggling. We celebrate the continuous living cultures of First Australians and acknowledge the important contributions Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have and continue to make in Australian society. So once again, welcome everyone. So our abstract, just a reminder so you know you're in the right place, is the APS PsyEd Interest Group is holding a roundtable on cultural responsiveness. The first part of the roundtable will review and discuss the draft annex, and I'm not even going to try, to the APAC Evidence Guide Standard 3 Program of Study, Criterion 3.8, and hopefully you've all got access to that as well. Now, this part of the discussion will be facilitated by Tony and Dawn, and they can tell you a little bit about what they've been doing to help with this and the role that they've played as well. And then the second part of the roundtable is going to focus on developing a response, which will be based on several organising questions. So Tony and Dawn, I'm going to throw it over to you. And thank you. Thank you both for your time and the work that you put in as well.
Thanks, Tanya. So did you want me to just kick off straight away, Tony, or do you want to start things off?
I'll just make a couple of brief comments if that's okay, Dawn. Yeah, thanks for those who have had a chance to look through the documents. Just to alert you to our website, auspac.com, you will find some useful links there to the document, as well as a podcast and a webinar that APAC have created, as well as the link to their survey. So if you're wondering how to respond, the link to the survey is on auspac.com and you can find that right now. And thank you for that. Dawn's going to introduce the background and the history and the importance of this working party. So thank you, Dawn.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, this has been a very exciting project to be part of, and it's got a little bit of a history behind it because APAC was a partner in the research that we did between 2013 and 2016, the Australian Indigenous Psychology Education Project, which Jackie and I were part of under the leadership of Professor Pat Dudgeon. And this project was to look at a number of things: why Aboriginal students weren't choosing to come into psychology and why we weren't able to retain and graduate the few that did. And when you look at the deficit of Aboriginal psychologists in this country, in order to be at parity, representing sort of roughly 3% of psychologists in the country, we'd have to have close to about 700. And I think last count we had something like 118. So there is a big deficit there. But in addition to that, non-Indigenous psychologists also need to understand the historical context of colonisation and the ongoing legacy that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders experience as a result of that history in a contemporary space. But perhaps more importantly, our own role in not only contributing to solutions, but also our contribution and our role in perpetuating the challenges that are faced by First Nations peoples. So APAC was a partner in that project, and they saw this as a very important role for them in changing the narrative of psychology to improve the education of psychology students so that everybody graduates with the skills and competencies and a repertoire of knowledge that will assist them in their professional role. The outcome of that research was that APAC endorsed the findings and recommendations of the study, and that in their 2019 guidelines incorporated this criterion of cultural responsiveness. I think it's worthwhile mentioning very briefly the language that we're using, which is cultural responsiveness rather than competence, because it's absolutely impossible, no matter how long your journey, no matter how committed we are, to be competent in any culture. And I would argue, including our own, because there are aspects of Australian culture, or my heritage is England. So, to claim that you're an expert in everything Australian or everything British would be an overstatement. So, to provide some relevance to that language. So responsiveness was used after much debate and discussion, because it's about responding to the context. It's responding to the needs of clients, of communities. It's also about responding to our own needs too, as practitioners. Again, clarity around language. I'm using the term practitioner in the same way that APRA uses that terminology, which is anyone who is a psychologist registered, or as a psychological scientist who has got some psychology education and is working and using that psychology education in their day-to-day life. That's a practitioner, whether you're an educator, an administrator, or a clinician. So APAC came back to us, Pat, and a few of us early in probably about 2020, and recognized that there were some challenges that higher education providers were facing in not only understanding what this criterion 3.8 is around cultural responsiveness, but how they embed it into their curriculum, and more importantly, how to assess it. And this is not surprising. Every educator who is currently facing the challenge of meeting these criteria has been trained within a known framework of psychology education, and that did not include cultural responsiveness. So it's hardly surprising that educators are challenged when it comes to looking at these standards and thinking, what does it mean and how do I do this? The other question is, why are we focusing so heavily on First Nations peoples? So to answer that question first, it's simply within the name. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders are the sovereign custodians of this landmass. There are multiple migrants who have arrived and who are the descendants of migrants within this country who are non-Indigenous. We don't have an equal status. So First Nations peoples are often viewed less favourably than non-Indigenous Australians. And this is about rectifying that deficit, that ignorance, if you like. So making sure that First Nations peoples are responded to, understood as First Nations, as sovereign custodians of this land, and that the rest of us are newcomers, regardless of how long we've lived here. We are newcomers to Australia. And so respecting the fact that this is the longest continuous culture in the world, something that we should be immensely proud of. So it's about restoring status in many respects. That said, the principles that we're calling for within this framework of respect and understanding and the acquisition of knowledge applies to any cultural group. And it goes beyond culture defined simply by ethnicity. it's about inclusion across the spectrum, and it's about the intersectionality of cultural identity. So, as I've said before, I'm English by heritage. So recognizing that bicultural identity, recognizing the fact that I am a British migrant in a land that was colonized by British migrants, and what that means about my identity, my role, my history, etc. So this is an important point within the language that we're using in the document. It also brings into play the notion of reflexivity. So understanding what it means to be a British migrant in this place and how that impacts on my role, my representation. What do I represent to Aboriginal clients or communities that I'm working with when they see me as a white woman, but one who is clearly, by my accent, English? What does that mean? How am I perceived? And what barriers does that represent to the people that I'm trying to work with? So APAC came to us and said, we've recognised that HEPs are having challenges in meeting this criterion, and we need to provide greater guidance for them in not only the definitions and the language that we're using, the rationale as to why this is necessary, and how do we help them to meet this criterion. And so, again, after a bit of discussion, this working party was formed. So I think it's an amazing initiative that APAC has come forward to say, we recognise that providers are struggling with this. How can we assist you? Now, it's not meant to be prescriptive. It's meant to offer a framework, to offer some suggestions, and to offer some examples of how some providers have attempted to meet this criterion. But I would like to emphasize, I think, that it's going to be a journey for all of us, because this is not something that is going to be changed within the psychology curriculum instantly. Just because we've got the statement by APAC, we've got this document, we've got the standards, is not going to guarantee the outcomes that we would like to see. It's going to be a journey, and every educator and every school and department of psychology is going to need support and assistance to achieve that, to support the students that they're training. I think that, do you want me to stop there, Tony?
Always got to remember to unmute. Thank you, Dawn. I think the preparatory comments were amazing, so thank you. And there's a little bit more explanation as to exactly what the working party has produced. But I just think this should be fairly open as well. If anyone has a comment and wants to put it in the chat, or stop us and ask for clarification or questions or anything, I think that would be wonderful. But after we've looked at the more explanation as to what the working party has produced, maybe we'll pause then and see what kinds of issues people want to raise while we're here. And if no one has any issues, that would be fine. You know, it's not like you have to have completely understood everything in the document, because the draft document with all of the examples is quite lengthy. But the beginning of that is what we're talking about, the actual working parties, what the working party has produced. So if I'll just continue on briefly and give you an overview of some of the processes, etc., and then we can have a time for discussion. And this is a document produced by APAC to facilitate some of the engagements with stakeholders that are starting, and I do believe this is probably the first one. The draft of the annexure was sent out on Monday, and that would have gone to every school and department of psychology in Australia, as well as members of various organisations, So you may have received an email about this, but we'll just talk a little bit about the process. So again, we've acknowledged our custodians there, and we've heard a bit about the overview and some of the background from Dawn, so we don't need to go through a lot of that again. So the standards are set up based around these 5 standards. These are the 2019 APAC standards, and we talk about 3.8 as a shorthand way of referring to the standard that specifically addresses cultural responsiveness. So this is summary here: cultural responsiveness, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, is appropriately integrated within the program and clearly articulated as a required learning outcome. So it's a simple kind of statement, but obviously there's a lot more to integrating into your curriculum and making sure things are taught and assessed, etc. Okay, so we have this draft document, and the intention is that it'll be an annexure to the evidence guide. So that's where we're heading. The beginning of it, which we'll call section 1, does provide contextual information, which the working party thinks is important. And I think you've highlighted basically all of those points, Dawn. We abbreviated this to First Nations First, was kind of a working phrase, or a phrase that was common within the working party as well. But we are so mindful that these principles should be applicable to other cultures, other settings, and it's a mindset, obviously, that we're aiming for to incorporate into all aspects of psychology training and practice that we're aiming for here, not limiting it to one small group. Many of these issues seem to have connections to other ones. So we've got comments around cultural responsiveness, cultural awareness, cultural humility, cultural safety, and reflexivity in the process of your lifelong learning journey. So if you think that it's a kind of a smallish topic, it's the biggest topic actually, because it really relates to everything that we learn and understand as we progress through our lives.
Penny, could I just jump in there for 2 seconds?
Absolutely. Would you like me to go back
Thanks.
to that?
Yeah, do you mind?
Yeah, sure.
There's a lot of commentary coming out from Aboriginal people, researchers, academics, psychologists at the moment, emphasising the importance of cultural safety. And I think it's very important to clarify what is meant by cultural safety. So the idea that we're striving toward as psychologists, as human beings, is that Aboriginal clients, Aboriginal students, people we might meet in the street even, feel safe working with us. So as an educator, I want Aboriginal students in my class to feel that it is a safe place. The important distinction I want to make here is that it's not up to me to create a safe space, as in I can't create an environment and guarantee that it is safe for an Aboriginal student. It is their subjective response to the environment that I create that determines whether or not they feel safe. So the safety aspect is how an Aboriginal student or client feels as a response to what I do and say. And I think that's a really important point to make. My role as an educator is to be aware of what is necessary. That means I have to educate myself. I have to be reflexive in understanding that simply my identity is problematic to many Aboriginal people, because simply being white, being English, can re-traumatize them, even if it's not that individual student or client who has experienced victimization. It's an intergenerational victimization, and it's a systemic and institutionalized victimization. So my reflexivity about that, my understanding of that it's not me personally, it's what I represent, is an important part of that cultural humility, cultural awareness, and responsiveness. Because in being aware of cultural difference, cultural diversity, and wanting to be inclusive in my practice forces me to acknowledge that I don't know everything that there is to know. That forces me to educate myself. It forces me to recognize that I have a long way to go on that journey. And it forces me to enact responsive behaviors, modify language that might be problematic or offensive to students. Even more broadly, I mean, look at the controversy that's come out from Beyonce and Lizzo's works quite recently. Beyonce's new album has used a word that is regarded as a slur. It's in common usage within society. So recognizing the words that we use, the actions that we engage with can be problematic. Sorry, that was long-winded, but I think those elements needed to be unpacked a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much. We're talking through the structure of the document, so moving on to section 2. So what the Working Party has provided are these exemplars of how you might choose to integrate cultural responsiveness within a program or course of study, program or degree course of study, and how that might be articulated as a required learning outcome. We've also felt that that was important to do that across the 4 levels of competency that are in the APAC standards. And I've realized that while I talk about level 1 through to level 4, not everyone does in terms of the way they refer to their structures, their degree structures. So what we have at the bottom in terms of level 1 are sequences that cover essentially the undergraduate sequence, but it could be done within a graduate diploma, but it's the beginning. It's the foundation competencies that are being covered in that level 1 program. And we've summarized comprehension and reflexivity as a learner as one of the ways of helping to conceptualize what we're looking for at that point. Level 2 is the equivalent to a 4th year or honours or graduate advanced. But again, the name could vary and is meant to be the point where people are completing the pre-professional competencies that are in the APAC standards. And we thought integration and reflexivity is so critical at that point. At every point, though, students will be encouraged to apply and practice these important skills and understanding. So this is not all about professional practice with clients at the higher levels. This is very much about your development through these stages, students' development through these stages.
And it's perfectly possible to apply all of those standards entirely at an undergraduate level, so that when you've got 3rd years leaving, going into a range of different professions, they have completed those higher professional competencies. And there are examples of programs that have done that.
So level 3 is typically the beginning of postgraduate training and can take perhaps typically a year, but it could also be part of a longer sequence. And level 3 obviously is starting to develop the APAC professional competencies. So we call that practice and reflexivity. And then level 4 are competencies that typically lead into more specialized areas of practice. And we call that advanced model of practice and reflexivity. So this is just a reminder, and the document trying to position the training sequence that leads people from not understanding much about psychology through to very advanced levels of practice, but it certainly does not preclude people applying the understanding that they've gained in a whole range of settings. So I think that point is made, but I just wanted to reinforce it as well. So we move then through the exemplars, which, as you might kind of see, are grouped according to level, with an actual example of what you might do at that level. Remember, not prescriptive. We have highlighted in the APAC competency framework where that example might sit, which a QF level that would typically reflect. Remembering there's all ways that you can package these things, so I'm not saying it's not a QF, but we've looked in the APAP documents, which we'll refer to a little bit as well in this session, but we encourage you to become more familiar with. And finally, given some example assessment tasks. So the one that the working party was really attracted to is the APS's apology, and there's a link to it in the document. And I actually had the privilege of being in the at the conference where that apology was presented. It was a very emotional time and very memorable point, I think, in the APS's development and history. So just pause there for a minute. So there's a lot of acronyms, but there's also some links to APAC, AQF, and APAP frameworks, if you're not familiar with them. And the document tries to represent this feast of frameworks and ideas that are being covered here. So you'll see this mention to the regulatory environment and the frameworks in the document as well.
Excuse me, Tony, I don't know whether you can hear me or not.
Very hard to hear, Dave, but if you could just speak up slightly more, that would help. Yes.
This is perhaps not really an issue for the working party, but looking at the framework document, which is excellent, from APAP, one of the things I noted was that the framework is being applied to the pre-2019, I think the 2010 APAC competencies, right, or the standards, where of course now we've got different competencies, different standards, and it'd be nice somehow to actually see an update of that. So I've gone through on my own accord and tried to do something based on the 2019 APAC standards, but whether I'm getting it right or not, I don't know. But it'd be really helpful to be able to see something a bit more concrete or updated.
That's a great comment. And I'm happy to respond to that. Yes, when we were doing the APAP research, obviously it predated the new standards. So everything that we did within that research was mapped against the existing standards. I'm happy to take that suggestion forward to the current APAP team, because there is a new iteration of the APAP research. So it's been raised before. As soon as the new standards were released, we did discuss as a team that this needed to be updated. But I think it's fallen off the agenda simply because they've got so much on their plate at the moment. But there's a meeting coming up, I think on Thursday, tomorrow. So I'll take it back to them and say that, this is probably quite timely to redo that curriculum framework against the new standards. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be at that meeting tomorrow as well, so that'd be good. The I suppose, as you would know, like the 2019 competencies are outcome based as opposed to process based, so that they are really different, the 2010 2019. So I think that's why it would be very useful in this context, in terms of ultimately really feeling like the APAC competencies are matching the APAP framework. Anyway, thank you very much.
You're welcome. I was just checking the chat and noticed Jackie has made a comment. Did you want to elaborate more, Jackie, or just leave the comment there?
Yes, just leave the comment there, but I do see that the document is, there's big blanks around the undergraduate level too, as I think I've discussed before. And yeah, I see that as a huge missed opportunity. I know there's some resistance to actually valuing these sorts of skills in undergraduate psychology, because it does take more thought than just pumping in the knowledge and a bit of research skill training if you're lucky. Now that's a model that that's a choice that has been made historically, to take out the skill training from the undergrad and put it into the postgrad, but then there's this huge bias around you can't have skill training in undergrad because that all has to be left to postgrad. But that sort of criticism is only acknowledges just that the only skill training you can have is to do with advanced professional psychology skill training. Psychology is broader than that, and I think that we can have skill training, like skill training in reflexivity at the undergraduate level. And imagine, and I know that Dawn used to produce graduates like this, imagine having graduates who are so culturally responsive that they're snapped up by any organisation who are looking for culturally responsive and reflexive graduates. And that's certainly what is capable of happening in undergraduate programs. And unfortunately, as Dawn said, there's only a few who do that. And yeah, anyway, leave it there. Thanks.
Thanks for the shout out, Jackie. Look, I would really emphasize that it is possible to have those advanced skills within an undergraduate program. If you look at what's the national survey after graduates have finished, course satisfaction survey that comes out from the federal government. If you look at psychology graduates, so people that come out with a psychology major after 3 years, you're very lucky if you've got statistics around the 60% employment mark. The program that we were running had employment rates of 98% for our graduates. And, you know, it speaks volumes when people that have graduated from our program, 3-year undergraduate bachelor's degree, are supervising master's qualified psychologists in organizations because they have better skills and better knowledge bases. I think it speaks volumes. So I agree with your comments 100%, Jackie.
And I had a slightly different point to make, and that is that APAC often reminds providers these are minimums, these standards. They're not limits to what people can do, and clearly you can aspire to do better than the minimum requirements. But this is the challenge, is how to make some progress from where we are. This is obviously the point of the working party and the annexure and the document that we're looking at. So just a couple more slides, and then we've actually got to have a nice big discussion then. The exemplars continue then through level 2, pre-professional competencies, which we've already explained. And then we move on to examples of practice. And this is really, so thanks to everyone, including some people here, I'm thinking, who might have provided some of those examples as well. There is a reference in the document to APAP's curriculum framework. And I think, David, you pointed out some of the outcomes that are focused on are not the same as in the current APAC standards. And I understand that can be challenging, but certainly there are there is a clear curriculum framework that can be very useful, I think, in terms of helping people think about their curriculum. And when we review the curriculum for a degree, the key to achieving something is to have a good, clear framework to use in that review, to know what it is that we're trying to do. So the Working Party does emphasize APEP's curriculum framework, which if you haven't got, we can certainly help you find, but it's on the Indigenous Psych, indigenouspsych.com.au, I think, is the indigenouspsychology.com.au website. Okay, so that was meant to just provide more explanation about the actual structure of the draft that the Working Party has produced. And I don't know if I actually said, but Dawn and I were members of that Working Party. So that's the hat that we actually are wearing right now, is to try and help facilitate people's, entering into, a process of reviewing that. Okay, on ausplat.com, if you look in the chat, you'll see the link. You'll find the short paper, the webinar, and the podcast. And then there's a process of discussion that will go on, and a survey that has been released, and people are invited to respond to that. And we'll look at some of those questions in a second, so you get an idea for what the survey is going to ask. Okay, so what I thought we might spend a bit of time doing, and big group would be fine, but if we couldn't have enough to separate out into two groups, is to really start getting into is the document, the key questions that APAC has asked for advice about. So is the overall draft guidance document effective? Does section 1 help clarify the intention of the criterion? We've already had some discussion, which is great. Does section 2 provide helpful examples how cultural responsiveness might be integrated within a program, how cultural responsiveness might be clearly articulated as a required learning outcome at each graduate competency level, 1 to 4, and does section 3 present helpful examples? So that's the focus of the survey that APAC has constructed. And then I was just going to spend a little bit of time talking about the curriculum framework, but I don't want to go over stuff if everyone knows this very well. And we've heard a little bit from Dawn about the history. Essentially, the 3 outcomes of APEP were the curriculum framework, the guide for increasing recruitment, retention, and graduation of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander psychology students, and the workforce capabilities framework. So these are all available on that website. And the last slide was just to remind people that the overall kind of conceptual model, if you like, is actually based on what Dawn was referring to a little bit earlier, which was implemented in an undergraduate sequence with some pretty amazing results. So that's essentially how the curriculum framework progressed through looking at this model of pedagogy, content, and engagement. Any further comments, Dawn, or we might move into some discussion then?
No, not really. I think the key thing I would point out from the curriculum framework is that it's the principles. Again, it's not a prescriptive document. Principles can be applied in any context for any level of learning and to achieve any particular outcome. So if you are building a sequence of learning, and my emphasis and focus is the first 3 years of the undergraduate program, if you conceptualize all of those principles being met within that, and that the 3rd year is the integration, application of advanced knowledges prior to graduation, then it's perfectly possible to have a good sequence that achieves everything that APAC is requiring from more advanced educational sequences, masters and doctoral programs. You can have that in an undergraduate program without compromising students' abilities to have a scaffolded education. In fact, a scaffolded education is essential to the outcomes.
Do we have any initial comments? I thought we would probably separate into two groups at this point, so there's a little bit more chance for people to engage in a discussion, but any overall comments, any feedback at this point? Phoebe?
Just some feedback. I like the idea of being able to integrate it all within the first 3 years to a certain extent, and I think that's what we're trying to do at UTS. And also in regards to the table that assists with responding to the APAC requirements, having just submitted accreditation documentation, I think that would be really, really helpful. I think it would have even enhanced our response to some extent. So it was good to see it broken down by the different areas that you need to respond to. So not just what's in the program, but how the staff are being trained, for example. So that's very helpful.
Yeah. Any other comments? We're down to 15 now, and I can just see the numbers probably dropping a little bit from here on. Okay, we might spend a few minutes then just reflecting on the feedback that APAC's looking for, unless there's other issues that people want to raise. Okay. Do we, at this point, perceive the section 1 as helping clarify the intention of the criterion 3.8? Any thoughts there? I must admit, it does require you to have a look at the document too. We've explained a little bit about it, but it's going to make much more sense if you've read it and had a chance to look through it.
I mean, for me, in one sense, it's sort of potentially preaching to the converted, to the ones who are here. I mean, they all probably already understand the need for this. When I read through it, I felt it done a very good job, I suppose, just trying to think about whether this was something that was completely novel to me, whether that would make things click. It's difficult for me to say, but I felt that it was pretty easy to understand and pretty self-evident what was being said personally.
Thank you. A couple of nods and thumbs up, I think so. Seems to have hit the mark there.
Yeah, I'll agree with that comment that what we have before this point is a lot of vague concepts and not much scaffolding. And what is really nice to see is that it being laid out in a very systematic way, not being overly prescriptive, but inviting educators to actually consider how you build upon the other. I think that initially a lot of educators will feel that this is a huge undertaking, and it would be. And I think that Dawn has pointed out the historical context, and it is going to be a huge undertaking, but we almost need to take this plunge to actually put it out there to say, this is what we're all striving for, and this is the potential way forward. And as people undertake that, hopefully we'll get a collection of exemplars, and then we can benchmark with each other, learn from each other, and hopefully in 5-10 years time, look back and say that we've come a long way.
Yeah, again, I think that's summarizing a lot of the feeling here. Thank you, Jen. Sarah, was that anything else you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to add, thank you, Tony. In addition to what's already been said, although the I think I am part of the converted being here and attending APAP. I really did find the image figure 1 a really helpful figure to consolidate how all of those concepts overlay. I found that particularly helpful, despite having been reading a lot in this space over the last 6 months. So I wanted to just to mention that.
Bringing it up in case people haven't had an opportunity to look yet. And the definitions are also helpful.
I agree with you, Sarah. I'll pass your comments back to Belle, because she was the one that came up with this image. And I think it really is helpful. It really helped me to sort of consolidate where all these fit together. And I feel like I've got a good handle on that anyway. But I think what it also does for me is by situating cultural safety at the heart, we're reminding ourselves constantly that it's the other person's response and interpretation of what we do and say that is critical. And that for us, it's the cultural responsiveness and the reflexivity that are the nexus points for that. Those are the two key elements, the two skills that we need to engage in and practice that will give us the best possible chance of clients and students feeling safe. Like I said before, we can't create that. We can't guarantee that. We can't enforce that on somebody. We can't say you will be safe because I've done X, Y, and Z. But by doing X, Y, and Z, we've at least given ourselves a fighting chance of achieving something positive. That doesn't mean to say that we stop. So yes, I agree. I think Belle's done an outstanding job in creating this image.
I don't think I recall seeing this image in the APEP framework documents. Is that right? So
it's not. It's new to this document, to APAC,
so
because
label, right? In that sense, like you are actually getting something that you don't see in those framework documents.
Well, one would hope so. We've been working on stuff, you know, ever since we finished the original APEP research. I mean, we haven't been standing still. So one would hope that we'd be able to generate greater clarity and more detail and more depth of knowledge and understanding. So it's good to see that hopefully, you know, people do see that we've achieved something here. But this diagram is unique to the APAC document. I think it's an image that is going to potentially go viral because it sums up so much with such clarity and simplicity. I wish to goodness I'd thought of it whilst I was still teaching. I've used various models and frameworks over the years. Mine always look 10 times more complicated than they should be. So yeah, it's a brilliant model.
Just moving on to the second question about section 2. So this is the section, whoops, go through the definitional bit. So section 2 tries to provide helpful exemplars, and thanks again, Jackie, for pointing out that the exemplars don't necessarily capture everything we might want someone to do at level 1, but obviously the panel thought it was important to have something there against each of the levels. So the response that they're looking for is, are they helpful? Any thoughts there? And I just read out the level 1 example before, but I can sort of scroll down and show you the level 2, 3, and 4 if that would be helpful.
Honey, can I throw something in here? Like I think the examples are really good. I think that's great. I guess I'm thinking about how do we ensure that the assessment tasks that we that someone might want to embed in their courses or their programs are appropriate, and do they need to be, so there's some conversation at our university about the role of the First Nations College at our university, and the role that the Indigenous academics within that college play in terms of the embedding of some of, of content throughout our programs and courses. And I guess my concern is the thoughts around this with psychology, but also not wanting to overwhelm my Indigenous colleagues with having to look at absolutely everything, because that's not helpful either. So I guess I'm thinking about what's a happy medium and what are other higher education providers doing.
And this is kind of moving us towards this idea of communities of practice and shared benchmarking activities. So that is part of the APAC standards, by the way. Everyone should realise that. I think that the idea of operating pretty much isolated, I think, is starting to disappear. And we're seeing these very helpful communities of practice around different aspects of the psychology programs developing, and many good examples we could cite. I think the goal there is that you develop shared resources and check with other people to make sure that if you think you've got a good assessment strategy that is going to tap into some understanding, which is part of this cultural responsiveness area, that they also would agree with that and support that. And I don't think there's another thing I can think of, but let me just check. Any other things we could add to that?
If I can jump in, Tony, yeah, that would be great. I love the question, Tanya. It's a brilliant question. You're very right in that, Aboriginal academics become the go-to and they just get burnt out. And it can also be a shortcut that allows us to abrogate our responsibilities to learn ourselves. So I think, in the first instance, well, there's two different aspects. There's the assessment itself, and then there's the content or focus of that assessment. In my view, I don't see multiple choice having any role beyond first semester, first year. I know it's convenient if you've got very, very large classes, but bluntly, I think it's a crappy piece of assessment. Anyway, so let's sort of look at the type of assessment first. My experience going through all of my psychology education was I got two types of assessment, an essay and a lab report. Lab reports are arguably useful because it's the template to write a manuscript, fair enough, but nobody's ever going to write an essay. It teaches you skills of how to write, how to communicate, how to integrate your ideas, admittedly. But again, I'd probably argue beyond first year undergrad, what purpose do they play? There are other types of assessment that you can use that teach exactly the same types of skills that are really stretching your students beyond those assumptions about undergraduate students and their capacity. So I'd really encourage everyone to start thinking about work integrated learning within the classroom. So using applied assessments at every conceivable opportunity. The other thing I would suggest is using semester-long assessments broken into 2 or possibly 3 elements so that students have an immersive experience of spending a semester really investigating a particular topic or issue. And I always encourage students to choose their own topics and focus within some guidance and some ballparks, obviously. But if they're intrinsically motivated in a topic, they're going to enjoy the task far more and they're going to provide better outcomes, which makes our jobs as assessors a lot more enjoyable and easier. So one of the ways that I used to do that was to devote at least one of my seminars. I used to work totally with seminars, 3-hour seminars, one seminar to actually unpacking what the assessment was trying to achieve. What skills is it trying to teach you? And why is this important to you as a human being, as well as a professional in whatever future journey you might have? And obviously use lots and lots of different examples. So why are these skills important, and why should you learn them? The first task was almost exclusively some form of presentation. And again, to develop the skills in a scaffolded manner, presentation started in first year with just, 2 people just doing a quick 2-minute, this is what I found, an investigative piece. Then we would move on to having, triads or whatever, so that by the time they got to third year, they were quite competent at working in groups of 6 or 7 effectively. So you're teaching conflict skills, you're teaching group process skills, et cetera, alongside the other professional skills. Have them do a presentation where they get feedback and encourage peer feedback from the rest of the class. Having feedback provided verbally in class in front of your peers so that they learn how to accept constructive feedback. Then have them translate that into some kind of written format. So in one particular example, I had them, sorry, I know I'm speaking too long, I'll shut up in a second. I would have them do some work for a not-for-profit organisation. They would have to investigate what the needs were of that organisation, come up with a plan of action. So you're making a pitch to the organisation to say, this is what I think would be helpful to you. What am I missing? Get feedback, etc. So it was as real life as possible. And then once the client, the organisation had said, yep, go ahead, that's what we want you to do, you then put it into a documentary form of a report or a strategy or whatever it might be. These are far more fun assessments. The content side comes in when you're helping students choose their focus, because one of the key elements of learning is about understanding that the people that you are going to be working with and serving in whatever career path you take are going to be diverse. They are not always going to look like you, think like you, be like you, behave like you, act like you. So in every single piece of assessment, you have to demonstrate where you are taking into account diversity. So we're avoiding ableism, we're avoiding homophobia, we're avoiding sexism. And that comes down to the language that students use in their assessments and in their tasks. So you can embed these kinds of things within your standard curriculum really, really easily with a little bit of thought and collaboration with peers. One of the things that I was very, very fortunate to have in my career is a number of Aboriginal mentors. Pat, of course, was one, but Vicky Hovain was another. We went through university together, and she's been an amazing friend and resource. And, I've been able to go to her and say, look, I know I'm on the wrong track here. I don't know what words to use. I know I'm going to stumble this, but can I just ask you this because I don't know the answer? And, she's been very, very giving in helping me to navigate spaces that I was confused by and that I didn't yet understand, despite having done a lot of reading and research. So my take-home messages would be, become allies to the Indigenous Centre in your university. And by being allies, I mean seriously, I want something from this colleague, but what can I give back? What can I contribute? How can I assist? And the first way to assist is to have done as much research as is humanly possible before you ask for their help. but don't only go to them when you need something. You know, have coffee, have lunch, form genuine relationships. The other thing that I was fortunate to have was to be in a school of arts. And so I had access to philosophers, historians, anthropologists all around me, all of whom are grappling with very, very similar issues within their discipline. So by talking to my peers and seeing how they were deconstructing these social issues within their particular disciplinary frames of reference, we were able to communicate and support each other and share ideas. So the collaboration doesn't only have to be with Aboriginal advisors and guides and colleagues. It can be with you know, anyone that is trying to achieve an inclusive society that is based on social justice. Sorry for that rant.
I thought that was great, Dawn. And I think it's certainly when I speak to academics within our school, you know, there is that whole reluctance to impose, but not sure where to go next. So I think it's a question that many of our colleagues have, and they're not sure of the right response or way to go. And, you know, like we're in a wonderful learning and teaching community, so we can ask these questions, but not all of our colleagues are. So I think that it's important to have those discussions, and it's important to say, well, what is everyone else doing about this thing? Because, you know, we need to do better.
I'd really encourage everybody to try and create a similar environment within their institutions. Cross-disciplinary collaboration is hugely helpful, hugely beneficial, and not having that, psychology for decades, generations, has kept itself separate and said, this is not psychology, therefore it's got no relevance to us. Psychology operates within the world. Every single discipline, every single human function and ability is linked to psychology. Therefore, it's applicable. Bring your colleagues into your classes. Have a political scientist come and explain to students about the social structures within Parliament, you know, looking at what it takes to get a bill through. These are important pieces of information that psychology students can learn from.
I'm going to just move us towards the end of the evening.
Yeah, I'll put myself on mute.
Thank you. And just to say the third element to the draft document is this outline of the APAC pedagogical principles. So I think there's 12 of those that are listed, and they've been used to help critique some of the examples. So as you move through and look at the examples that were very generously provided, the level that that example applies to in terms of those 4 competency levels in the APAC standards, the assessment that was made as to which pedagogical principles were involved, a question that APAC might pose or seek clarification about, for example, 10 and 12, is that actually reflexive understanding that's being developed, and is it active experiential learning? So there's 2 principles that were picked up. So really just to try and highlight what perspective the Working Party think are really critical to be applying to these examples that were provided. And
Tony, sorry to interrupt.
Just David, yeah, go on.
To go back to the evidence example, I like what is here in the sense that there's a bit more variation across the examples. The example that was given for the evidence with the learning outcomes and the framework, the APAC framework, I like how there's that one example that you can see at different program levels, and how you can see some, gradual building up. But it'd be sort of nice to see something that's, a little bit of variation across those examples as well, like there is here. I suppose the thing that I'm thinking of, and I'm only really thinking about it now, so I'm probably going to get this wrong, is that when I look at the apology example, I don't know whether that would be the sort of thing that's sort of very easy to put in like a first year introductory unit or a standalone unit, which I know that Charles Stewart's doing. But I suppose if I'm thinking more about, it'd be useful to have like an example in sort of typical, first year social, first year cognitive psychology. I mean, even where I am, we do, neuroscience at an undergrad level. Just maybe thinking about an example that wouldn't be in a standalone unit or in a very first introductory unit. It'd be nice to see something like that. And I wonder whether...
I think that's the kind of feedback they're seeking as well, David. So
okay.
Good points.
And maybe the other thing I would just say is that I know that in those framework documents, they're really putting emphasis on subjective well-being as a construct in terms of, what they really want to try and emphasize in the curriculum. I don't know whether that would be a good one to have an example for, if that is one of the key ones that they really want to try and get people to think about. But anyway, I just wanted to make that comment on, from last time. But yeah, I like how there's a lot more variation here to think about.
Yep. And you can see there that there is a provider who has covered multiple levels and really does look at this longer term strategy. So that's, I think the goal really is to come up with a strategy which is going to have over a period of time multiple ways in which cultural responsiveness is taught and assessed at all levels, and the kinds of connections Dawn has been talking about from the beginning with key colleagues in other disciplines, if you have an Indigenous college, people who are in the profession, people who are working in diverse areas. I mean, there's a range of things there that I think are picked up on. So I think rather than prolong the formal kind of part of the note, which is what I feel like we've covered the document at least, and I've highlighted what the key issues are that APAC's looking for your response about. I thought it was also useful just to see if there were other issues or concerns that anyone wanted to raise while we're together, remembering that this is being recorded. So, kind of be slightly careful about, what you might want to raise. But I think we've done what we set out to do, which is to introduce you to what's going on in the process. And we're very happy to again respond to any other questions. But are there anything else anyone had on their mind that they wanted to raise while we're here?
Tony, one thing that struck me from that last table as I was reading through it was that quite a number of the examples, the comments were that it was more reflective, it was more reflectivity rather than reflexivity. And I'm happy to put my hand up to say that I have no idea how to make how to differentiate that. And I assume that a lot of educators were probably struggling with that. So if anyone can provide some guidance as to how do you differentiate that, because in terms of thinking of curriculum change and update, probably might be helpful to get some help to clarify the distinction between the two.
Thank you, Jen. It's one of those topics that I think will take a bit longer to deal with, and maybe that's, I think, feedback for APAC as well, that it might not be as straightforward, but there is a definition of reflexivity in the APAC curriculum framework about understanding your own identity and cultural heritage and how that's impacted. So that's the purpose of focusing on reflexivity, reflecting simply being thinking about something, and trying to be more objective about an experience is not exactly the same, obviously.
If I can give you an example that comes from one of my colleagues as to how she explained this to students, I think it might possibly be useful. She uses the example of standing in front of her mirror each morning when she gets dressed, and she said, "Oh yeah, that outfit looks nice, or that works. That's good. I haven't sort of made sure that all the buttons are done up right, and this, that, and the other." As opposed to, why did I choose this particular outfit for this particular day, for this particular function? So particularly as a woman, you have to be very, very conscious of what you are conveying, what narratives you're conveying by what you wear. So reflectivity is simply, yes, that works within known parameters. So in terms of psychology, it's, am I reflecting, am I performing within the expectations of the knowledge frames that have traditionally been taught? Reflexivity takes into account that what that might mean to others. So in what ways has psychology been deficit in considering culture as a crucial central element to humanity? Up until, well, it still is. Culture is referred to, particularly in research methods classes, as noise that can be controlled, or a variable that is to be explored relative to the dominant cultural identity of whiteness. That's reflexivity. So it's questioning whether the boundaries and parameters of your discipline and your professional practice and your assumptions as a human being are taking into account how that might be perceived by others, and what is it leaving out? Whose voices are being privileged in the commentary that you make in your classrooms and in what you write? Yeah.
Thank you, Dawn. That's very helpful.
Pleasure.
Do we have any other
Like,
comments? Sorry, Jackie.
metacognition or meta knowledge as well. That notion of knowing what you know, what you don't know, etc.
Thank you, Jackie. Maybe one more comment. I'll then go to Tanya just to wrap us up for the evening. Melissa, you've been spectacularly quiet tonight.
Always pretty quiet, but I'm really enjoying. I'm trying to work on a new unit for our grad dip, and it's about correlational research methods, and I'm trying to have the first session, around the assumption, or the scientific. You look at any textbook and it talks about the scientific method, and what's the scientific method in psychology, and so I'm immersed in this right this moment about trying to do this justice, to point out and get the students to think about the assumptions involved in that. And I'm trying to come up with an assignment question. So I think, Dawn, if I was going to write down what you said, that's the assignment question. In what ways has psychology been deficit in, except for I didn't catch the rest of it, but that's the question.
In constructing its knowledge of the world or of human functioning, yeah. I think it's a great question. Have you seen the evidence-based practice and practice-based evidence paper that came out from DPRAT? That would be very helpful to that class.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, obviously I should have a look at that. Thank you. So yeah, I've been deep in thought and writing down notes to get inspiration. So
feel free to give me a buzz anytime. I'm always happy to.
Oh, thank you, Dawn.
Flesh out ideas. Anyone, very happy to do that.
Thank you. Thanks for I would have just sat there quietly. I was about to type something, Tony, actually, but thanks for the opportunity. You're kind of bringing me into the conversation. It's good to actually, just kind of say what I'm looking at doing while I've been listening.
Thank you. And over to you.
Can I just, sorry to interrupt, but I just wanted to go and check my understanding about this reflexivity versus reflectivity. So when I think about reflection, the thing that makes it different than just like if you get some feedback, the difference between kind of navel gazing, which is just kind of how does that, pertain to me as a person? The thing that makes it reflection is where you're thinking about how you're going to embed the feedback or information into your professional practice. Whereas reflexivity would be thinking not just about your own practice, but your own practice in a systemic way. Do I have that right?
Yes, I'd go a step further and say reflexivity would require you to ask whether or not your practice was appropriate.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So
yeah.
should we be throwing the rule book out and starting again?
Yeah.
Because, and I think to some extent, this is what we've, well, almost what we've tried to argue in the evidence-based practice paper, because that paper started out being a template of how to do experimental research, quantitative research. So it assumed that the definition of research was that. Unfortunately, I joined DPRET just when that was going to be approved and official and rubber stamped and what have you. And I said, oh, hang on a minute, I've got a problem with this. So reflexivity is, what are we leaving out? What are we not considering? And that paper argues for epistemic equivalence. So at an epistemic level, the philosophies that underpin quantitative experimental research methods is legitimately equal to the philosophies, the epistemology that underpins qualitative, subjective, socially constructed research methods. That's a groundbreaking step for the APS to take, to publish this paper with that argument at the heart. So that paper should be in all your research methods classes. First year undergrad.
And we could have a whole other conversation about the importance of qualitative research, because there are many qualitative researchers here, and we've been told for years that our research isn't really real. But anyway, that's a whole other session maybe. And I could get on my high horse about that one, Dawn. But I wanted to thank Dawn and Tony for their time tonight, and of course all of you. We know that we certainly very much appreciate you coming along, even if it's midweek. We know everyone's tired. I've seen children, I've seen puppies. Everyone wants a piece of this now. So we really do appreciate everything that you are doing. And the work that Tony and Dawn have done, not only on this project itself, but presenting tonight, has been very much appreciated. So if you can show your reaction by clapping or whatever you would like to normally do. For those of you who are aware of it, we have the AusPlat site. Karen's been great at posting it throughout the session, and it's in the chat. Tony, there is a survey for people to complete tonight, is there not?
I'll send out an email with the link to the evaluation of tonight, so you'll get that tomorrow.
Yep. But of course, give Tony a couple of days and then it will be available on the this recording will be on the AusPlat site anyway for you to view again and listen to the wisdom of those people who are here. So thank you everyone, and we'll see you next time. Bye.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Thank you very much.